United States being formed by colonies that revolted against the dictator. Wasn't the great fear that the founders had that we would devolve into a dictatorship? So, like, literally, the entire purpose of the Constitution is to not allow us to have a dictator.
Absolutely right. I mean, the world's first constitutional democracy was conceived in revolutionary insurgency against a king, against monarchy, against the union of church and state, against the lords and feudalism and so on. And we, the brave founders like Tom Paine and John Adams and Samuel Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, they thought that this was the most dangerous thing. And that's embodied in the Constitution. When my colleagues fall into that fifth grade fallacy of saying three co-equal branches of government, they can never explain, why does Congress have the power to impeach, try, convict, remove, and permanently disqualify from federal office a president, and he doesn't have the power to impeach, try, convict, remove, and disqualify us, right? It's because the founders of the country were seriously afraid of what a mad king hell-bent on wars of vanity and conceit and imperial ambition could do to everybody. That's why Congress has the power to declare war. That's why we've got the power over the budgets. We've got the power over taxes. Trump is the first president to dare to say he could just impose tariffs on his own. Tariffs have always been adopted by Congress. He's citing federal statute in IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which doesn't even mention tariffs, which is why he got struck down by the Court of International Trade. And I hope he's going to lose all the way up to the Supreme Court on this. He keeps arrogating powers to himself that don't belong to him, that belong to the people's representatives, because, as Madison put it, Congress is the preeminent branch of government. The president's job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed.
So one last question on this, because it is something I get asked a lot about in real life, and I also get a lot of questions in Democracy Docket about this. So if Congress passes a budget and says, go spend $100 on a widget, how does Donald Trump have the authority to not spend the $100 on the widget? And is it because Congress passed a law in 1970 something or other that said it, or could presidents never do that? Like, sort out for us, like, what is the power of the president to not faithfully execute the law?
The president has no power not to faithfully execute the laws. That's what the president's job is, to take care that the laws are faithfully executed.
So then what's this whole debate about with this
so here's what the
law and everything?
Well, I mean, there's really not much of a debate. I mean, the president does keep losing on all of this. He has no power to just impound federal money because he disagrees with it. He has no power just to unilaterally rescind a budget expenditure. He does have a statutory power to come back to Congress to request rescission, to say that there have been whatever substantial changes in the circumstances, the facts on the ground, and he's asking Congress to rescind the money. But that remains Congress's decision, not his decision. And if it doesn't happen in compliance with that statute, it can't happen, which is why, as you know, there have been more than 375 cases brought against us. And we have more than 200 temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions that have been issued by judges from the most conservative in the land to the most liberal in the land, saying, no, you have to go ahead and implement the law that's been passed by the House, passed by the Senate, and signed into law by a president. And the president does have the power to veto. That veto can be overridden, but once it's been signed into law or overridden into law, the president has a very simple job, which is to execute it. That's the president's job, not to legislate. And that's very clear from Article 1 of the Constitution. The very first sentence that comes after the preamble says all legislative power is vested in a Congress of the United States.
So I want to ask you about what is happening with Donald Trump and American cities. And I want to broaden this from the discussion that I see in so many places, which is really about Washington, D.C. And don't get me wrong, you work in Washington, D.C., I work in Washington, D.C., both of us live around Washington, D.C. So what is happening there is an absolute travesty in my estimation, in my opinion. But I think it is wrong for people to think that Donald Trump only wants to deploy the National Guard and the military in Washington, D.C. And we know this because actually the first city he sent in the National Guard, the first city in which he sent in the Marines was actually Los Angeles. And, we're seeing him have a back and forth now with Chicago. He has mentioned New York. And, I don't think that this ends with just Washington, D.C., or even those cities. I think this is part of an effort by Donald Trump to put U.S. military, National Guard in blue cities. And we can talk about why that is. I think it relates in part to the 2026 elections. But talk to us a little bit, both as a member of Congress, as a student of American history and constitutional law, and also of politics. What do you make of this effort by him? What is he trying to achieve? What ground does he stand on? And do you agree with me that you think this spreads much, much further?
Well, I do want to come back at the end, Mark, to where you began, which is the elections next year, because I think ultimately this is his objective and his destination, which is to create a series of crises and pretexts for intervention that would allow him to alter the course of his electoral destiny. Right now, he's going down. I mean, they threw 17 million people off of Medicaid health care. It doesn't really kick in until after the election, but everybody understands there are already rural hospitals closing. It's totally changed the health sector already. They threw 20 million people off of their SNAP nutrition benefits. So they understand that his popularity is sinking like a stone right now. So ultimately, this is about the elections. But if we look at it as an historical and a legal and a judicial matter, there are all kinds of boundaries that are being destroyed by what he's done. One is that we don't use the military for law enforcement purposes. That's the meaning of the Posse Comitatus Act. That is a sacred principle to our revolution and our Constitution. We don't believe in a standing army that can threaten the liberties and the freedoms of the people, something that the right used to insist on, although they've all grown mum on it right now. So that's one major problem. Another is that the president is completely collapsing the difference between what's federal and what's local. And DC is a great example of that, because the Home Rule Charter for DC from 1973 says that the president has the power not to take over the police department, but to direct the mayor to make the police department available for the purposes of addressing a federal interest where police are needed. A great example of that would actually be a violent insurrection at the Capitol, precisely where Trump did not try to get the police involved or send in the National Guard. He did everything in his power to prevent that from happening. But in any event, that would be an example of a real federal interest. Another would be the protection of a prime minister who's in town and
Right.
they need 8, squad cars or whatever. Okay, but Trump says, no, I'm going to take over the police department, which he has no statutory power to do, has not been given that power by Congress under the Home Rule Act. And he says, I'm going to do that in order to clean up the graffiti, the filthy graffiti in the filthy streets and the blight of homelessness. These are not federal interests as contemplated by the Congress and the DC Home Rule Act or by the Constitution itself. These are local interests. And so he really kind of obliterates that distinction there. And he's been doing that all across the country by trying to militarize the cities and then deploy the military for law enforcement purposes, which is not what they're trained to do. They're trained to be war fighters and not to go enforce laws against graffiti or jaywalking or whatever it might be. So it's a mess what he's done. I think that the silver lining here, Mark, is that it's created a very positive political backlash across the country, where the mayors and the council members and the people of these cities and towns are saying, this is ridiculous. And they're getting sympathy from people in other municipalities saying, look, crime is at a 30-year low in the District of Columbia. Homicide is down in Baltimore and in Chicago and so on. The mayors and councils actually have stuff to teach Donald Trump about crime fighting. But the fact is, under American federalism, if you want to get everybody together, great. That's when it works best, when the feds are working with the states and working with the localities to try to fight crime. Have a summit on what's working around the country. How are these mayors actually effectuating such a major reduction in homicide? They've got some really interesting techniques they've been using. We should be sharing those rather than just bringing in the National Guard from South Carolina or Mississippi to DC or hypothetically Baltimore or Chicago. I mean, in DC, they've been hanging around Union Station or the Washington Monument taking pictures, which is nice and everything, but that's not a crime fighting strategy. And in fact, a lot of people are starting to say that Trump knew that crime has gone down so dramatically around the country, and he just wants to be able to take credit for it by sending the National Guard for a few days.
Yeah, so I want to pick up the point that you mentioned at the beginning about elections, because my view is that Donald Trump is desperate to undermine free and fair elections in 2026. That everyone who looks for a unifying theory for Donald Trump, and they try to find it like in tariffs or trade or crime or whatever, it's all a bunch of bullshit. Like, Donald Trump has no core belief on anything. The only thing that has motivated his political career is power. And it is the escalating use of force and threat and coercion, of unsavory tactics, breaking norms, whatever it is, in order to acquire and keep power. And he is more desperate now than ever before, because he is viewing down and the unpopular polls, the cutting of healthcare, the sort of decadence and corruption of his administration. And he's afraid he's going to lose control of Congress in 2026. And if he loses control of Congress, the difference between Jamie Raskin having a gavel and some Republican having a gavel is, for Donald Trump, night and day. I mean, it's also night and day for the American people, but for Donald Trump's narrow interests of keeping power, it's a really big deal. And so he will do anything he can to keep power. And so the unifying theory of why is he requiring Republican states to gerrymander new maps? Why is he saying he's going to ban mail-in voting? I was asked by Chris Hayes why he said, what's behind the strategy of Donald Trump banning mail-in voting? And without missing a beat, I just said, because Democrats vote more by mail. It's not any more complicated than that. The reason why he still wants to ban mail-in voting is because Democrats use mail-in voting more than Republicans.
That's not exactly an Agatha Christie mystery.
Correct, exactly. It's not three-dimensional chess. It's not even chess. It's barely tic-tac-toe. I mean, that's the game that Donald Trump is playing. And he has targeted unspecified voting equipment. I'll tell you what voting equipment he's going to target. He will specify the voting equipment when he finds out what voting equipment is used in Baltimore, what voting equipment is used in Detroit, what voting equipment is used in Atlanta, what voting equipment is used in Charlotte, right? He will target the voting equipment that is used in blue cities because he doesn't want Democrats voting. And to your point, and this is maybe the most controversial part, but you opened the door on this, I want to go back to it, is I think he wants to deploy federal law enforcement, surge federal law enforcement, and also deploy the National Guard